I'm a professor in the medical school at Stanford. I've been a professor for 20 some years. I research infectious disease policy, infectious disease epidemiology, lots of other topics too, health policy, health economics, but certainly including those, it's been a long time interest of mine. In the middle of the pandemic, in October of 2020, I wrote a document called the Great Barrington Declaration. Anyone signed it in the room? Oh, God bless each of you. The document basically called for a managing the pandemic in the way that we managed pandemics for the past century. It called for protecting vulnerable older people because it was very clear from the epidemiological data that it was really older people that had the highest mortality risk if they were infected with the disease. And it called for lifting the lockdowns, including school closures, including all of the restrictions on normal life, because those lockdowns, it was also again clear from the data, were causing much more harm than good. And in particular to the lives of young people, it was causing much more harm than good, especially for the lives of children. This is the three of us. This is Martin Kulldorff. He was at Harvard University then. And Sunetra Gupta, she is at Oxford University. She's the professor of theoretical epidemiology at Oxford University. They're both rock stars, incredible scientists, decades long of experience publishing in epidemiology and biostatistics and in a whole host of fields. The document, I should say just up front, that the document itself was the least original thing I have ever written in my entire life. It had nothing really new in it. It just reflected what a century of pandemic planning and experience with managing pandemics had led, what we knew about pandemic management. It just distilled that into a one-page document that was understandable for the public at large. The key reason for the document, if you read it, you'll say, well, it's in simple language, Jay, how come there aren't 50 footnotes? How come there aren't like long detailed plans? Because we wanted to remind public health professionals that they were violating the normal pandemic management plan to a disastrous effect, and the scientific evidence, disastrous effect. And we wanted to tell the public at large that that was the case. We wanted to tell the public at large that there were scientists who disagreed with the way the pandemic was being managed, and that in fact there was a different way, that in fact there was not a consensus in favor of the lockdowns in October 2020 among scientists with relevant experience. Right? So really the most important thing about the document was Stanford, Harvard, Oxford. Right? It was to tell the public that you guys are not, if you thought the lockdowns were a crazy idea, that you never heard of such a thing before, it didn't make sense to you, that you were not the only ones, that there were in fact a tremendous number of scientists who disagreed with the lockdowns, who saw the harms they were causing, who understood how inefficacious they were, and who understood deeply that it was out of line with how pandemics were normally managed. Right? And it worked. We wrote the document on October 4th, 2020. Tens of thousands of doctors, epidemiologists, and scientists signed the document. Almost 1 million people signed the document. The principles, it actually is based on two very, very simple scientific facts that everyone agreed with then and everyone agrees with now. Older people were at much higher risk if they get COVID than younger people. The younger people, the risk of getting COVID and dying from COVID was, much, much lower than the harms than they were facing from the lockdowns. And then second fact, that the lockdowns were harmful, that they were causing tremendous damage to the psychological, physical, and economic well-being of every single person they affected, especially the most poor and the most vulnerable people of the world. So what we called for then was lifting lockdowns, young people, normal lives, and also equally important, better protection of vulnerable older people. The theory was that somehow protecting older people was possible only with a lockdown. Was already false in October 2020. It was false in March of 2020 when we imposed it, but it was certainly false by October 2020 when 40% of the deaths already had happened in nursing homes, despite the lockdowns. That 80% of the deaths have been people over the age of 65. Right? The lockdowns had already failed. And you don't need to squint very hard to see what the consequences of it. So Sweden, oh, you have to see this slide. You can't miss this slide. This slide is the most amazing slide of the entire pandemic. Yeah. This slide is all-cause excess deaths in Sweden and the United States. You care to guess which line is which? Sweden followed something roughly like how normal respiratory virus pandemics are managed. Right? They didn't, for instance, close schools forced schools to close for anyone under the age of 16. The kids in Sweden had normal life, no masks, no social distancing, just regular childhood for the entirety of the pandemic. Not a single day were schools forced closed. And there may be a school here or there that was closed, but nothing for anyone under the age of 16. And in the spring of 2020, this was very clear. It was very clear that what they had done already worked, that there were no kids that had died. In the summer of 2020, there was a report that came out that showed that the teachers themselves had lower deaths, COVID deaths, than the average of other workers in the population. So Europe opened schools on the basis of this evidence. The United States and many, many states kept them closed on the idea that we were going to protect human life better. But in fact, what happened was that the all-cause excess deaths, this is cumulative all-cause excess deaths since the start of the pandemic, accumulated body after body after body in the United States. That's the red line. The green line is all-cause excess deaths in Sweden per capita, and you can see that Sweden won the pandemic, if there is such a thing as winning a pandemic. I live in California. California had, my kids were out of school for a year and a half. My mom didn't leave her house for a full year and a half. It was an absolutely miserable lockdown time, especially in Northern California where I lived. Florida, I was an advisor to Governor DeSantis during the pandemic, and he opened schools in the fall of 2020. He opened businesses. Disney World was open in the summer of 2020. Disneyland didn't open until late into 2021. Florida has lower all-cause excess deaths than California since the start of the pandemic. Right? So it's not that Florida did great, compared to Sweden, but that's partly because of our population is less healthy than the Swedish population. But it did better than California. The lockdowns didn't help protect human life. Lockdowns actually were damaging to human life as a whole. The pandemic policy that did not rely on lockdowns was the wiser strategy in retrospect, but it also at the time. Okay, end of epidemiology talk.